So I'm really, really delighted to be talking to my sister, Mary Dunnewold, as if it isn't obvious with the last names, because in all of the interviews that I've done so far, it's been with makers and artists, and I've really wanted to talk to a writer. And Mary's book has just been released. It's called Fine Thanks, Stories from the Cancerland Jungle. And it's powerful. It's a very powerful book, and I want to share a conversation with her about that book and find out more. And I want to start by thanking you for being here, Mary, but I also would like for you to describe who you are and what your background is, rather than having some sort of scripted bio.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me, Jane. I have to comment first that Jane teased me for a long time because when I was 6, I had blue glasses. And I'm sitting here looking at Jane and she has blue glasses. So I love them. So I love them as much now as when I was 6.
Full circle. I learned from you.
Yeah.
Maybe I was jealous. You were only 6. Anyhow,
so my background is I'm actually a lawyer, and I taught writing to lawyers for over 20 years. I taught legal writing, which is a very different kind of writing. It includes a creative piece, and it includes storytelling, actually. So I did a lot of professional writing that way and tried to teach lawyers how to be creative storytellers in the writing that they do. I shifted in my career about 6 years ago, where I started doing Title IX investigations for colleges, which actually also takes me to writing a lot, because I write a lot of reports for other people to read about really pretty difficult stories. So I do a lot of professional writing that way. I have always wanted to be a more creative writer. And so for about the last 10 years, I've been trying to add creative writing into my life in all sorts of ways. And this experience of having stage 3 breast cancer in 2010 led me more down a creative writing path, because I realized as I was into that experience and in the couple years after, just how powerful writing is and creative writing is as a healing tool.
Wow.
So I wrote this book that's just being published. I wrote in 12-13. My cancer experience was in 2010 through about 2012. And I wrote the book in 2012-13 and have been pretty much working on it and working on trying to get it published ever since.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. I'm thrilled.
Yeah, you should be thrilled. Bringing any sort of creative project to fruition it's a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's very, very difficult, and it's very emotional.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that was one of the things that intrigued me about talking to you, because I ask these questions of creative makers or artists all the time, visual people, but I haven't really thought to ask the same question. So like when you were writing, is there a particular way that you settled into, like, did you protect writing time as opposed to when you were doing your job? Or what did you do to set the environment to feel good about getting started on writing?
Yeah. So in general, I do have a pretty structured routine to my day, and especially on creative days. I get up and I walk my Malamute for an hour in the woods every morning. And I think that's really important in my creative process. And then I have to do all my kind of busy work, housework, and by which I mean I have my breakfast, but I have to clean it up, and my bed has to be made, and then my desk has to be all organized, and all. So I need to lay the foundation for a kind of a clear mind, because that's just how my brain works. I actually think that hour so I have my walk where I do a lot of thinking, and then I have my hour where I do a lot of just fussing around. I think that hour is really important, not just for sort of clearing the decks, but for letting the ideas I was thinking about during my walk kind of percolate without me trying to think about them. So part of that process of just doing dumb stuff, I think is really important for my creative process. So
Mhm.
then when I sit down, it's sort of the same thing. I open up my computer and then I have to make sure my email's cleared and I'm not worrying about any communication. And then I'm ready to actually write. So I have that creative process when I have a creative kind of a day, and I'm fortunate to not work kind of the same schedule in my professional life every day. So I have a couple days a week generally when I can do that. Even when I'm not doing that, when I'm really interested in and thinking about a project, I usually find some time in the evening where, you know, I'm tired and it's the end of the day and it's 7 o'clock and it would be so much easier to just, you know, sit down and watch 2 hours of TV instead of 1 hour of TV. And I kind of trained myself when I was writing this book in particular to say, okay, just 20 minutes. If I just sit down at my computer for 20 minutes and do a creative process thing, that'll make my evening better. I'll feel better about my evening. And that's hard to do. It just takes a lot of, yeah, you have to really talk yourself into it. But usually when I'm able to do that in the evening, I end up at my computer for, you know, I say at 7 o'clock, it's just gonna be 20 minutes. And at 8:30, my husband's looking for me and wants to know when we're gonna watch TV. Because once I get into that flow, then I'm in the flow and I don't wanna leave that.
Mhm.
But it's like I have to be a split brain to get myself to do that.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that becomes its own reward. It's not like
Yes,
you're saying
totally.
you're gonna get a bowl of ice cream or what people usually think of as rewards.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
sometimes I listen to things where people are talking about getting motivation going, and they're like, "Well, yeah, you're gonna be able to go buy a new pair of shoes at the end of the week, or you're gonna be able to eat something that you wouldn't necessarily eat." And sometimes I personally feel as though that's sending the wrong message, because once you get into the flow of it, that's its own reward in some way.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I think our brains are actually built that way, right? We're getting some sort of hormone rush when we're doing
Yeah.
it. And but on the other hand, it is so hard sometimes to convince yourself to do it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, so if you're really, really stuck, then what's the motivation? Or do you get afraid? Like, do you get afraid? Were you writing and thinking, "Oh, I'm never going to be able to, I won't be able to come up with anything else?"
You know what I get stuck on? I get stuck on why the hell am I doing this?
Oh,
And I've actually struggled with that as a writer and felt like if I were a visual artist, I wouldn't feel this way because then I'd have something like to put on the wall or to people I can bring it out politely for a minute and show it to someone and they can politely say, "Oh, that's nice." But with writing, you can't do that, right? With writing, you need an audience in a different way than with the visual arts. At least that's how I perceive it as a writer. Visual artist, you might perceive that in a different way. But so I get myself tied up in knots over those questions. And like I have a novel that I spent 10 years on that I know is never going to get published. And in my worst moments, in my head, I'm calculating how many hours have I spent on this stupid thing that nobody else is ever going to read. I mean, a couple people have read it, but so what? But I'm not going to do anything else with it. And what I have to do for myself when I get there is think about how every creative step you take builds to the next thing, And I think if I hadn't spent what at that point was like 5 or 6 years on that novel that's never going to get published, I never would have been able to write this book that I am getting published.
Yeah.
Because of course I became a better writer
Yeah.
while I was doing that. However many hundreds of hours it was,
Yeah.
don't ask me to calculate it, right?
Yeah.
I think also on if I do get stuck on what am I going to do next or like that, uh, um, giving you credit, Jane. I haven't done your creative strength training class because I've spent most of my creative time on writing. But I think the whole idea of kind of the cross training and doing something else to get a creative part of your brain going when the part that you're trying to exercise isn't cooperating. So I like to do things like I'll go to the Art Institute and just look at things, or I'll try to read a writer whose writing I really admire for its beauty and technique. Or I do have other little visual things I do that are pretty dumb. I'm not a visual artist and I don't paint and I don't draw, but I, like you've seen at my house, Jane, I like to make these little tag cards just because I like colored paper and I love stickers and I love stamps and pens and all that, and just kind of putting on some music and cutting things out and putting stickers on and all that gets something else going that I think fuels the creative process that can help me get unstuck on the writing where I feel like I'm actually competent.
Yeah. No, I totally understand that. And I think, well, that's why really the whole creative strength training idea is because you're a cook. And
Yeah, yeah,
that's another way that it all plays out over time. It's like,
yeah,
I guess I think of it as this arsenal of ways that we can be creative. And if this, and we all maybe have our main drive. Maybe some people are really good at everything.
mm-hmm.
But I think we have the main impulse that we choose. And then we've got all these other things that are in the arsenal. So if you're not writing or you're not making and you're stuck there, I go cook something, or I go, right now my focus is, I can't even believe it. I planted this big garden and then we got this horrible drought. And then all these little plants started sprouting and I couldn't figure out what they were. And it turned out they were zinnias that just
Like,
pollinated on their own.
yeah, yeah.
So I just focused on watering that. So that was my creative exercise in September. And now I have
Yeah.
this beautiful little zinnia garden going. And so my point of that is that if we can broaden how we think about the arsenal of creative things we're capable of doing,
Mm-hmm.
then that's all fuel for the most important thing that we've chosen to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it
Absolutely.
helps the wheels turn because I'm out there watering, but I'm really thinking about what went south in the studio and,
Yep.
that kind
Totally.
of, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. I love that. I love it that we both share that. So have you gotten comfortable with describing yourself as a writer?
No.
Oh, come
Yeah.
on.
I was considering that question as you prompted me. How do you describe yourself as an artist, as a writer? And the first word that came to my mind was as a wannabe.
Oh,
I'm a wannabe writer. But I thought, well, I'm kind of a wannabe adult too. I don't think of myself as an adult. And I've been an adult for a long time. And then I realized, I don't think of myself as funny either. And people tell me my book is funny. So that must mean I'm funny sometimes. So in some ways, externalizing all that, I think really helps me own it. And I hear a lot of people say, you're a writer if you write. And going back to what I was saying earlier, it's hard for me to get away from, well, actually, you're a writer if other people read what you write, not just if you write. But I still struggle. Like if people ask me, what do you do? I still struggle to say I'm a writer. I always talk about my other professional stuff first. Will that change with the publication of this book? Because now I actually feel legitimate? Maybe. But actually, I've published a book before. I published a legal writing book, and I have written 100 articles on legal writing. And somehow I don't count that as being a writer. So, that it's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I am learning from just thinking about this at your prompting and about the conversation, I really need to practice that. I need to go around to people and say, I'm a writer.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe then I can internalize it more.
Yeah, and you're brave to say that, because 90% of the people who I run into in classes or through a class like CST, or this is actually going to go out through the newsletter where there's going to be a bunch of people witnessing to it.
Mm-hmm.
And most of us have a hard time admitting or calling ourselves something that's creative.
Yeah, right.
And so,
Yeah, I know I can think of friends who I knew them for a long time before I knew that they were like amazing painters or
yeah,
could draw or whatever, or was a musician in some amazing way, because for some reason, a lot of us are just, we learn to kind of protect that part of ourselves, I guess, because it's so vulnerable,
I
right?
think you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're right. And I think it also, I don't know, it'd be interesting to do kind of a test of this across the country, but a friend of mine gave me a little canvas bag, and on the outside it says, I was born in the Midwest and then I left. And so I think there's something to be said, right or wrong, about how low many of us, and I don't think it's only about the Midwest, that's kind of
Uh-huh.
a joke, but I think there is something about how many of us within 2 or 3 generations, how we were raised, where we discount these gifts that we have to be writers,
Mm-hmm.
artists, or creative,
Mm-hmm.
just basically creative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that part gets sublimated to the job.
Yeah, right. Our identities are our jobs,
Right.
whatever.
And that could be a mother, it could be parenting, it could be an official job. And of course,
Yeah,
parenting has always been sloughed off to be the bottom of the totem pole.
yeah, yeah.
And so
But
that's one thing we're always I'm hoping that we can undo through conversations like this.
yeah, and I think that's a particularly American cultural thing too.
I
I've
think so.
heard, I can't remember where I heard this, but I've heard that, like in Europe, if you get into conversation with someone, they'll talk about their identity in terms of their family. Like they won't, the first thing you exchange in that getting to know you conversation is not actually your job, it's about your family.
Mm.
And I think for us in our culture, it's much more likely to be about our jobs and what's our creative process. That's way down the totem pole of
Yeah.
the information that we volunteer.
Yeah. And that's my whole, I'm 65 years old, and if I've got another 40 years in me, which I sure hope I do,
Me too.
my whole goal is to get us to think in terms of who we are creatively and express that, because it encompasses everything. I'm a mother and a grandmother and a sister and an artist, and I've had jobs running restaurants and all kind, and isn't it
Mm-hmm.
great? Wouldn't it be great if we could look at the whole package instead of only one or two pieces of who we are?
Yeah, right.
So, well, I love talking to you. We could talk all night, but I have a question just to wrap things up here, and it is there anything about learning to be more creative that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share?
Um, in thinking about that, what kind comes to mind for me is about for me having to learn to convince myself that having low expectations for this moment and this hour and this day is a road towards a creative process. So even, for instance, low expectations about how much time I'm going to put into this, which kind of goes back to my 20 minutes in the evening. And sometime in the last year or so, I read an article about scientists, somebody doing research about people who have been really creative in their lifetimes. And in particular, I remember reading about Charles Darwin and how his daily routine was like, get up, take a walk, work for 2 hours, have lunch, take a nap, take another walk, maybe work for another hour. And you know, and the article was saying, actually, that's how we best work creatively, is by having just a few hours in the morning and then maybe another period in the afternoon. And I think that this expectation of that I used to have of, if I'm really good at this and I'm really able to do it, it means I can sit down at my computer at 8 o'clock in the morning and I can take half hour for lunch and I can work until 4 in the afternoon. And that's how you write books. And maybe that's how Stephen King writes books, because he writes like 3 books a year. But that's not how most of us are creative. So having that low expectation about time, and then having to, within even that short amount of time, having a low expectation about this word or this sentence. You know, there's so many times when I have to knock myself on down the road by, it doesn't matter what word you write down now, you can come back and change it. It doesn't matter if this sentence sucks in this moment, you can come back and change it. You just got to keep going. And I think having, cultivating that voice in my own head about low expectations in all these ways, and knowing that I have time and not feeling like like my life is short or I'm always busy or whatever, you know, I can take all the time I want. I have this infinite resource in front of me and I should just go for it. And that's what gets you to, well, and I don't even want to say, I was going to say that's what gets you to an end product that you're happy with, but I don't even think you should be worried about the end product that you're happy with, because going back to the 20 minutes in the evening, just sitting down and doing that feels so great. And that's what really should, as you were saying, that's what should be the reward.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully spoken.
Thanks.
Beautifully spoken. Okay. Well, we'll talk about the book, Fine Thanks, Stories from the Cancerland Jungle, and we'll advertise it through the newsletter and put up a link. But I'm
Great.
so glad you and I had a chance to talk
Yeah.
on a level that we don't necessarily get to talk.
Well, maybe we need to do it by Zoom more often.
Well,
with prompts.
Maybe we do. Maybe we do. But I'm so grateful that you were here. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with everybody who will have a chance to listen to this.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I loved it.
Good.
Okay.